want to welcome our speakers, Lena, Bumke, and Francesca Pick, who will be speaking to us about power, purpose, and money, right? Transparent, participatory, dynamic. How do money in organizations differently? So before we get started, just want to make sure that I have everybody coming in. Oh, this is amazing. Everybody's coming in at once. Please ensure that you're muted. There will be a question period at the end. You can, I'll monitor the chat, so you can put questions in the chat too, so you don't want to lose any thoughts. But, please don't overload the chat, and feel free to use the reactions buttons that you have available there. Zoom is wonderful for that. All the recordings will be available for you in about 2 weeks in the event portal. So I'm just going to put that there. So know that that's available. You'll find the recordings linked after each completed session. If you have any technical issues, you can send me a private chat, and I'll see if I can help you. And yes, I think this covers pretty well everything I need to do, except to say again, welcome. And I'm just so happy to meet Francesca and Lena to speak to us about transparent, participatory, dynamic, whatever, all that it contains when we're talking about money in organizations. And now I'll leave that to you, Francesca and Lena, please.
Thank you, Francine. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. So I'm Francesca Pick, and I'm here with my colleague. We're actually in the same room. You can see my hand over here. So this is my colleague, Lena Bumke, and we're both part of the distributed, self-organized collective Greaterthan. And we accompany leaders, companies, startups, co-ops, networks, communities who are all interested in creating and transitioning to new organizational forms that really are based on shared leadership and ownership. And since the beginning of our work on this topic, we've been extremely focused on the area of money. And that's actually why we're here today, to share on this topic. Because interestingly, Greaterthan is a collective that was born out of various distributed global communities that have been experimenting with new organizational models for a bit over a decade. And in working in these very sort of practice-based communities, one of the things that we realized is that there seemed to be a very big gap between how many of the different elements of how we organize were working, and then the area of money and budgeting. And it sort of seemed like, well, so many of the different spheres of work, from decision-making to roles, to how we meet, to rituals, that those were all really maturing, but that somehow in the area of money and budgeting, we were still very much working in traditional mindsets, and not breaking out of the power over control dynamics. And so when Greaterthan started, we really wanted to take on that challenge and help close that gap and really support the people out there and the groups that want to really open up this topic and think differently about money. So that's why we're here today, to try to give you an overview of everything that we've learned over the years of doing this, what we've been experimenting with internally in our own organization, but also giving a bit of a meta overview of all the different dimensions that there are when you think about creating an alternative system for dealing with money and value flow. So I guess just to give you a really quick overview of what we're planning on doing today, we're going to have some time for questions at the end, as Francine already said. And what we want to take you through is first talk a little bit about common challenges that we've seen over the years when it comes to money in self-organizing systems. Then we're going to give you a bit of an idea of some things we consider foundations for taking a new approach to working with money. Things that we think need to be in place for this to actually be successful. And then we have a couple design questions, design parameters that can actually help you get started with creating your own budgeting system. And then we're going to share some practices, mostly from within Greaterthan, that we've been using and sharing our experience with those. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into our first piece here about the common challenges. And so I want to just give a very rough overview of some of the top challenges that we've seen. It's definitely not an exhaustive list. And Lena's going to post in the chat also a link to an article that I wrote that gives a bit more detail about each of them, because I wanted to just sort of give an overview here. And if you're curious, then you can read more detail in that. So challenge number one that we've encountered: low participation in financial decisions. So one of the things that I've seen so many times seems to be that organizations that want to involve everyone in decisions, especially as soon as it comes to budgeting decisions or dealing with money, there's a very big gap between how many people they'd like to be involved and the reality. And I've talked to so many different groups where the reality is quite shocking, and sometimes I would say significantly worse than probably in a very traditionally organized company, and maybe quite risky also in that respect, because you might have one or two people that are actually looking at the finances, and everyone else often just out of actually love and trust saying, "You got it, I trust you, I don't want to question what you're doing, you go ahead." And that way actually there being way too little engagement to be making the right decisions, or maybe seeing things that need to be identified. So this is definitely something that seems very difficult, and that there's a lot of challenges to get people engaged in these decisions, which actually brings me to the second point, which is that it's hard to understand the finances, and it can often be quite intimidating. And I think this is one of the barriers for people to engage, that often the people that are sort of deeply in the numbers, it's very hard sometimes to see that the spreadsheet that you created doesn't make sense for everyone else, and that maybe when they look at it, they just feel completely overwhelmed. I've been in a lot of meetings like this before, where maybe someone who worked on a detailed spreadsheet shows it, and then everyone sort of, the energy drops in the room. And even though they want to contribute, it's hard to get any feedback. And so I think it's important to highlight that when it comes to finances, a lot of our bookkeeping systems are quite rigid. They often don't allow us to represent the money or the money flows in a way that's easy to understand. And that just because something is officially open doesn't mean it's actually accessible and easy to understand, and that usually quite a significant effort is needed to be made to actually present numbers in a way that people can understand, and also that you really need to invest a good amount of time in building what we call financial literacy, for more people to actually get familiar with the numbers and get a sense of what is a normal number for a certain cost and what isn't, and develop a bit of that intuition for numbers. So that is definitely a really big barrier to entry, I would say, in terms of getting involved. Going to the third challenge, which I would say sounds maybe a bit trivial, but is a really tricky one. So the group cannot agree on what core costs are. By that I also mean like fixed costs. So in any organization, and like let me take an example of a network, there's always going to be a set of costs that everyone agrees, okay, this is part of our basic operating cost. And people can have very, very different understandings of what needs to be included within that. Like, what is the bare bone that we must always be funding? And what is nice to have on top? So one example that I want to give that comes out of the community context, actually from the Inspiral network that maybe some of you have heard of, it's from New Zealand. So there was often this conversation about what do we need to keep the lights on, right? That was sort of the metaphor used of the basic operating cost. And there's this role that anyone who's in communities and networks will know is really essential, which in their case is called the role of catalysts. And it's sort of a role of a person that's making lots of connections, that's keeping an overview of what's happening in the network. It's a very often sort of invisible kind of job, but it requires talking to lots of people, making connections, and helping everyone sort of see the whole of what's going on. And so for many of us, we see that as an absolute essential thing that you can't not have in a network for it to be able to function and to be healthy. But there was always endless discussions about whether that should be included in the core costs or not. And I've seen many, many variations of this kind of debate in different contexts. In a traditional company, it might be something more like someone who's helping create a positive culture and making people feel good, doing emotional labor, as we also call it, supporting others. These are the kind of things that there can be a lot of disagreement about. Yeah, what actually goes into that baseline. And then let me come to the fourth challenge, which is actually my favorite in the sense that it's the most juicy and interesting, which is money avoidance. And so by that, I mean that in a lot of organizations that are trying to organize differently, there is often, not always, but especially in ones that have a strong mission and purpose, there can be an avoidance of money and just wanting to like push it away and basically not spending money that's there, or even not attracting it. So maybe not going out and fundraising because there's a fear that we don't actually have a good process for how to decide about it. And maybe a fear that it will create tensions and make things more difficult. So it's sort of like easier to just keep money out of the picture and just do things on a volunteer basis, for instance. So that's something we've seen a lot of also NGOs or community groups that then sort of don't get to the next level of operating. So that's just like a quick overview of some key challenges. It's not all, as I said, and it's just to give you a bit of a taste of some of the things we've encountered and how we've then ended up working on these different practices and also sort of design principles that we're going to share next. So I think with that, I'm going to pass to Lena, who's going to tell you a little bit about some starting requirements that we think are needed to be in place if you want to really go into alternative budgeting and money practices.
Yeah, because of course, now that we heard these challenges, and maybe you have also encountered some of these challenges before, we want to like immediately jump into the nitty-gritty of the actual processes. But we realized that there are actually a few things to consider first. And I think I want to flag first that there is no one-fit-all model or formula that you can just, take and apply, and this is how we're going to do financial decision-making from now on, because the process that you design will heavily depend on the type of decision. And you can see that within Greaterthan, we have a huge range of decisions around finances that we make. So this can range from consent-based decision-making in small teams to advice processes where the individual almost decides by themselves, maybe with the advice of one or two people. And for you, that might mean first understanding what is the context that you are taking these financial decisions in. What are the core values of your organization and how are you governed? Because financial decisions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in the context and in the kind of the thick infrastructure of your network or organization. And then becoming more concrete, what are the financial decisions that you're even designing for? And to understand that, just first make an assessment of what are the ones that you are actually faced with on a regular basis. And then you can take it a step further and see, okay, we have all these different kind of financial decisions that we're taking, let's say every month, every half year, whatever the cadence is. And how risky are they? This is an important kind of factor to take into account. If we spend that money, how strongly will it affect the course of the whole organization? Because it will lead you to kind of choosing different models. And also who needs to be involved, because they either have important context or expertise, or because they will be heavily affected by the decision. So these are some things you might want to consider. And then there's a kind of a different foundation that we believe is crucial, no matter what your core values are, if you want to go for more progressive practices in terms of financial decision making. And the first one, you can see there are two layers. The first one is agreements, and the second one is open books. And I'm going to talk to both of them briefly. So agreements. We believe that it's important that you have some form of written agreements in place that give you a guideline on how you want to deal with money and finances. And we have that within Greaterthan. It's part of our handbook. That means also it's publicly available. You can read this up later if you want, the whole thing. I will spare you most of the details, but I do want to read the very first paragraph because I think it's quite rich. So it says, Greaterthan is committed to clear, transparent finances and continuous open dialogue about money and value distribution. We know that such conversations can feel uncomfortable and do our best to create a safe and trusting environment so we are able to address and practice how we talk about and spend our money. And I just want to point out that in this kind of small paragraph, there are a bunch of things that are implicit. We don't say them explicitly, but they're in there. That, for example, we tend to our relationships very deeply to create what we call a high trust environment, because that high trust environment is actually, an important foundation for a lot of, in order to be able to hold the complexity and also sometimes challenging conversations that happen around, collaborative financial decision making. We also do our personal work around money. So in order to have the capacity to hold those conversations well. And then there are a few other things that might be interesting for you in our financial agreement. One is we have project independence. So all different projects, the teams that work on a particular contract or client, they all have independent budgeting. So they decide amongst themselves, how do they distribute the money, what do they use it for, and how to distribute amongst themselves. The only thing they all have in common is that 15 to 20% go to our common bucket. And this also leads to another thing that's important. Most of these things that we're going to that we're talking about only apply if you have some sort of common money, because that's when collaborative decision making about that money becomes interesting. And then we have kind of the real world manifestation of the intention to have open and transparent finances is what we call open books. Fran already mentioned that just because financial information is out there doesn't mean that it's actually accessible and understandable. And particularly in Greaterthan, with all this project independence, we had a lot of decentralized information. It was open in terms of everybody could go into the spreadsheet, but that would always only give you a very tiny window into what was going on. And it needed that information to be centralized again for us to be able to look at the whole picture. And for example, what we are able to take out of our open books at the moment, and doing that with, super easily, is to see how much does each member earn in Greaterthan and from which projects, as well as what is in the common bucket and how is that kind of distributed amongst different common buckets. And with these foundations, I'm going to give it over to Fran again to get us a little bit into the juicy parts of designing.
Thank you. Sorry. So I guess one thing I also just wanted to add, in terms of the open books and now what comes next, is that we just really wanted to emphasize the aspect of openness, that if you choose to have the financial information only available to very few people in your organization, you are just by default limiting quite a lot what you can do when it comes to participatory money practices and involving people. Because basically, even if maybe you give them information about a little piece, they're not seeing the full picture, so it doesn't really allow them to step into full responsibility around that decision. And it definitely takes a long time for people to get more comfortable with that bigger picture, but I think that's the most like real way to do it if you really want to, people to take ownership and responsibility of those decisions. And so looking at these design parameters, this is sort of a tool that we've developed that actually it's part of a course that we run called Thriving Networks. And that course is specifically to support networks and communities that want to bring their money and value flow into flow. Well, basically, help their resources flow more and figure out how to approach these topics. And so we've created these design parameters to sort of help you start thinking about, for the different types of financial decisions you have, what actually do they need to look like? So connecting with what Lena just shared, you're going to have a lot of different types of financial decisions in your organization. And for each of them, you're going to want to run them through these design parameters and probably also others that might be relevant for you. And then figure out, okay, for this type of decision, what dynamic is the right one? And that will then help you also choose a specific practice and a tool to actually use. And it's just really important to emphasize that it's not like, oh, I pick one way that financial decisions happen and they all are like that, right? Because it's so granular. There's so many different types of decisions, and you need to really look at each one in its own context. So just briefly looking at these different parameters, and then I'm going to sort of talk them through on an example of one decision type we have in Greaterthan to make it a bit more clear. So the first one, is the decision, does the decision-making mechanism, should it be more autonomous or more collective, right? And we have a spectrum here, so you don't have to be exactly one or exactly the other. There's many different options, and then you can sort of find the right practice to fit with that. And that's really answering the question, how much autonomy do you want each person to have in the financial decisions that relate to their work specifically? Then we have the factor of openness that we've already talked about quite a bit, right? So do you want financial information to be publicly available? Do you want it to be available to everyone in the organization or just a few people? So basically, based on that, you go further towards closed or open. Then there's the question, how many people are going to be involved in the decision, right? Is it all the people in the organization, a subset? Is it just very few? Is it one person? All of those are possible. And then two, which I think are also quite, different from a lot of traditional budgeting, which is, are you choosing a model that allows you to be very responsive, right? So deciding to spend money based on circumstances that occur and things that are just happening, and then there's a need that arises? Or is it something that you plan beforehand? So like traditional budgeting, where you maybe have, your annual budget and you have everything allocated to different areas very early in advance. And then very closely connected to that, is money flowing in a continuous way, or is it a fixed rhythm? And so in a way, these last two parameters are sort of related to each other, because obviously if you have an annual budget, then once a year, there's a certain time where everyone is doing the budgeting, versus continuous is something that it's happening all the time, and it's in this more responsive manner. So just looking at these parameters with the Greaterthan development bucket to make it a bit more tangible. So in Greaterthan, we have this thing called the development bucket, and it's basically a pot of money that we have set aside that is for the personal and professional development of our members. And so what we've decided is that we want decisions about that to not involve very many people, to really be as lean as possible, because it's not the kind of thing, okay, if Lena wants to go do a 3-month training, right, and it's going to cost 2,000 euros, Like maybe it's not worth the whole collective doing a big decision and discussing whether she should do that, right? So the idea of the development bucket is that through this mechanism that we've set up, she can basically look at how much money is available in the bucket, and then can just make basically claim money out of that bucket to go towards her training. And in this case, actually, it's a match fund. So 50% she pays herself, and then the other 50% come out of that common pot. So this, we can say, is a very autonomous decision. So she can make it alone, or what's also recommended is that you maybe get advice from 1 or 2 people if it's above a certain amount. Like I think we have written maybe like more than 500 euros, something like that. We have the open financial information, so people can see how much money is available. And also, of course, the information on the rest of Greaterthan's finances as well. Very few people are involved, as I just described. And it's a super responsive and a continuous mechanism, right? So the need comes up, oh, I want to do a training, then I can just draw funds out of this bucket. And it's continuous in the sense that that bucket is always available, you can always draw from it. And when it is empty, then we make a decision, which then is actually a little bit more of a slower collective decision to then refill it. But basically, it's super dynamic in that regard. So I hope that makes a little bit more clear, just on one example, what we mean with these design parameters. And the idea is really that you could take any type of decision that you have in your organization, or that you think you're going to have, and then design the right decision-making mechanism that you want to have based on these different parameters. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Lena for the practices.
Yeah, exactly. I think this was a really great transition because you just got a taste of what practices do we use. And I'm just going to continue adding to that and also kind of locating them on this spectrum so that you get a better feel for those different parameters, as well as the different practices that we use within GT. And of course, this is not a complete, this is incomplete, and there will be many more practices that might make sense for your organization. The first thing I want to mention is that we already said that money conversations can be hard. And why is that? It's because money is neutral. We each hold individual and collective stories about money. We have our relationship to money, and those things inform how we show up in conversations and decision-making processes. And in order to, become aware and be more conscious and able to, what I like to call navigate the stormy waters of collaborative budgeting, navigate potential triggers that come up, it's really recommended that you do at least some amount of personal money work, of inquiry. And a great way, like something that we practice ourselves, something that we also host, is the money game. It's a great starter, but then there are many layers you could go deeper, for example, with the CU money course. So this is back kind of to the foundations, practices that are foundational to even start doing this work. And then we kind of have different decision-making groups. Fran just mentioned the advice process that we use, for example, for the development bucket, but we also have a bunch of consent decision-making. We use Lumio to do that. So usually the way it works is, I'm going to use a concrete example. Twice a year, we run a hike. So we have a period of 3 months where we intentionally fund internal initiatives so that they can continue to develop the organization. This can be biz dev, this can be comms related. There's a huge variety. And what happens is, how do we decide on the budget we allocate towards those hikes? And this happens through a consent decision-making process. So one person or a small team comes up with a budget proposal, they put it on Lumio, and if there are any objections, we work through them so that in the end, everybody understands how much money do we put aside for that and why. And you can see that this is pretty collective in terms of, it's not a consensus decision-making process, and it does not require all members to participate. It's kind of lazy consent, yeah? But it's still pretty collective. It's very open because we all have the relevant information. It's almost everyone, it could be everyone participating. It's responsive, but it's a fixed rhythm because we do this twice a year. It's pretty clear when in the year that happens, with some flexibility. And what I find interesting is then how do we, once we have that budget put aside, how do we allocate it? And I think this is one form of collaborative budgeting. And in that case, we use Co-Budget. It's an online platform that is designed for groups and collectives, organizations to do that collaborative funding. And that works in a way that everybody gets allocated a certain amount of money, every member, and then they get to distribute that amongst the different initiatives that you can just see there now on the screen, depending on what they feel is right. At a certain point in time, what is important for their organization. And you can see that different initiatives got funded differently. This one was from our last hike. Oops, wrong direction. And what you see is that it's super autonomous because every person gets to decide by themselves, They don't need to consult anybody. It's open. It's many people because all members participate in this. It's relatively planned in terms of we know that this is going to happen at a certain point in time. And it's also, again, a fixed rhythm. And what I find interesting about collaborative budgeting, this is one way of doing collaborative budgeting, a very different process is what we call the happy money story. So the happy money story is how we mostly, if not always, distribute the funds that we have in projects. So none of us get a fixed salary, but we always do use like a collaborative and relational process for agreeing how we should distribute our funds amongst the team. This is a consent decision. That means that everybody actually needs to be a full yes for it to go through. And I think something that's really revolutionary about the happy money story is, on one side, its flexibility, but also its premise, because the premise is that everybody needs to be happy in the end. Like that's what we are, what informs our decision. Is everybody happy? And if somebody says, no, I'm not happy, the conversation continues. I had led many transformational experience and really deep learnings from this practice, and I believe many other members had that too. And I want to speak like a little word of warning, because to hold such a process, you need really strong relationships. You need to be able to trust and kind of rely that all members will be able to speak up if something doesn't sit well for them. And you need to trust and be able to trust that if something comes up like that, you're able to resolve it if there is a conflict or tension. Because if that's not a given, then this is a pretty dangerous process to take, and it might actually cause more harm than it causes good. And again, you can have a brief overview. It's a super collective decision. It's relatively open because what we decide will then be transparent, but the process itself is usually kind of closed for just the team that participated in that project. And this is it. Yeah, this is it. And I'm going to give the word to Fran for closing words.
Yeah, so that was just to give you a bit of a taste of, some of the practices that we've been experimenting with, developing or building on based on things we've already learned in other spaces. And so I guess, in closing, I just wanted to reinforce again this idea that, as I said, the fourth challenge of the money avoidance that I find so interesting, it's really a psychological question. And that when we look at money, a lot of these difficult topics come up. And so that's why we really think it's extremely important to be supported when you do this kind of work. And it can be a little bit intimidating. I really hope also that with this presentation, we haven't sort of done exactly that thing of feeling like, oh my God, this is so much and it's so complicated, but maybe, helped break things down a little bit. But I guess I just want to really encourage everyone, on the one hand, to try to see where you can maybe take first steps and do small things to create little experiments in this area, but also really to not be afraid of seeking out help and support and peers to do this work. And that's why, as Greaterthan, we're really committed to providing that support. On the one hand, for organizations that maybe want really, like specific guidance in venturing into these topics. But as I mentioned, we also have things like courses like Thriving Networks, where it's really about connecting you with other peers that are facing similar challenges, and slowly opening the lid on these difficult subjects, and making it maybe a little bit less scary, and slowly figuring out what is that first step that you might be able to try. So I think it's really this combination of encouragement, but also taking it serious for what it is, and just being careful and creating the right conditions for you to succeed, because I think that's what we're really passionate about, making sure that people actually can have positive experiences doing this, because I think in many cases it maybe goes awry, and then people are like, oh no, I don't want to do that. So we really hope that we can encourage you to take the first step, and are open for your questions, and also for any connections or requests that you might have to stay in touch and talk further outside of the event.
Thank you, Francesca and Lena. We're almost out of time. We've got 4 minutes. I do see a question that I really it's, what is your definition of happy? Can you answer that in 30 seconds?
Totally. Yeah, I can go really fast. So happy is a very undefined term, and I think it's very individually sourced. It's often, and I think that's some of the magic, that it's subjective, and it has often to do with like an immediate kind of physical feeling. But I do think that because there is so much conversation happening before we say, are we happy with this or not, there is a more mutual understanding of what happy means for each individual.
Great.
And so I just saw this other question here from Yuyan, if it's okay that I take that.
Yes.
So I shared earlier the link to the money game, which I think is a really great starter practice to do either as a group or also individually, because it's really about that first step of teaching you about your own behaviors and relationship to money. But it's a really great way to start conversations about it and sort of help people suddenly broaden their understanding of like, wow, people have such different approaches and notions connected to money. And it's not like directly implementing a new way of making decisions in your group. It's just sort of opening the field, and will maybe give you also, I think it's a really good temperature check to see like, where's my group at? How ready are we for this? Because it can bring up a lot, sometimes less, and it might help you get a sense of what you're ready for.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you both. And yes, everybody, and you can certainly use the chat to express your appreciation to Lena and Francesca. There's already a lot of comments there thanking you for sharing your knowledge, and this this is a topic that can trigger a lot of people. So I like the idea of happy, being happy in our money story. So we have 1.5 minutes left. Do you have some last words of wisdom for us?
I think be prepared that if you embark on a money journey with your organization, this will also be a personal transformational journey, because they go hand in hand, and I don't think it's possible to do one without the other.
Yeah, thank you, Lena.
Thank you. Yes, individual, nothing. Everything starts with us, and then it can go out to the others, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I on behalf of SOFA, I really want to thank you both again, Lena and Francesca. I want to thank all the participants for your attention, and I'm hoping that we can leave here with some seeds, and go forward with that. So hopefully we'll see you in some other sessions, and I wish you a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.